All right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture podcast. I am Ken Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Dan Scheinman. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Ken. Really great to be here.
I'm so glad you're doing this. So Dan has a career that I imagine is quite varied, but I think can be broken down into two very broad chapters. He was the Senior Vice President of Corporate Development at Cisco, which at various times has been, I think, the most valuable company on the planet, and certainly one of the most valuable and important companies in general. And then has a second chapter as an angel investor. Although to call him an angel investor would be like calling Mark Zuckerberg a startup guy. He's invested in companies that have achieved billion-dollar valuations, have gone public. And most recently, that company was Zoom, which is one of the big IPO successes these days, which you invested in when I think it was a guy and an idea and a couple of resumes. So welcome. Congratulations on that, by the way.
Thank you, Ken. It's exciting to be here right now. It's an exciting time in this area. And it's, to be honest, there's nothing more thrilling than helping people realize their dreams, which I really think is what good investors should do. And I was with Eric, literally, I was the first check into Zoom. We were in Palo Alto at a coffee shop. And
You're out of Central Casting. Like we're in a coffee shop in Palo Alto.
Right out of Central Casting. Eric was and is a remarkable founder because not only was he technically gifted, he understood customers at a very deep level. And I had decided on the drive down that I was going to invest in him regardless. I didn't really care. I didn't even know what he was doing, and I was going to invest in him. I didn't need to see the presentation because there aren't that many people who are technical and understand how to sell to customers.
Right.
So I sat down and I said, Eric, here's the truth. I love you and I'm with you.
Yeah.
And I handed him a check. And he said, well, did you want to see what we're, planning to do? But I was too deep into this persona at that moment.
Yeah.
So I basically said, no, Eric, I don't need to. And then he said, for both of our sakes.
By the way, you're so far telling a cliche Silicon Valley story. Like, here, Larry and Sergey, keep the check or whatever.
Right. Absolutely. And I felt that Eric was that caliber of person, and history has proven right. Yeah. And it's been very rewarding watching him be able to. Now, let me also, the thing that wasn't cliche is we could not raise any money after the initial round because
he was the wrong guy, right?
Wrong guy, wrong market.
Yeah.
Right. And what we heard was too old.
Yeah.
And also we heard video conferencing is dead. Right. And here was the guy who had been at the birth of video conferencing. Right.
So Eric had been at WebEx, is that right?
Correct.
And he had seen, I assume, something in the market.
Right.
Like there's a problem here.
I'll tell the funny story, which is that he believed that it was going to move to the cloud. Yeah. And we would march into the famous VC funds, and in their reception areas at the time, this is 2011, 2012, there would be signs up saying the future is mobile, the future is cloud, right? And we were getting thrown out within generally 10 to 20 minutes of our presentation. And so I realized we were pitching to the wrong person. We should have been pitching to the receptionist, right? Yeah. That was looking at the messages all day. Yeah. But there was great skepticism about could we compete with free? And Google and Microsoft, and could we compete with WebEx? Yeah. And no one really believed that this transition to cloud was going to be a break moment in the market, which it turned out to be.
It's fascinating to me how convinced VCs are about things, and that's kind of is or is not correlated with what is true. So that is a very reasonable, to me, explanation of the world. Like, hey, how can you compete with free? Google's in this business. You're not going to beat Google.
Right.
Completely reasonable. And then wrong.
So, and this goes back to when I originally started doing this, angel investing in 2011, I realized that one way to make a small fortune in angel investing is to start with a large fortune, right?
Yeah,
and
of course.
Right, and the way to do it is really to be derivative of what the big firms are doing, because in general they are going to get the best properties in particular spaces. But what bugged me a lot was that in fact the traditional archetype of a successful founder didn't seem to match the founders I actually knew. From my time at Cisco and other places. Right. And I began to feel that there was venture capital is a great business 2% of the time, right? And I began to believe that there was a failure of the archetype to find outliers, and that there were at least some outliers who were outside of that traditional, early on, outside of that traditional path. And originally I began to say, hey, like Eric, a lot of founders north of 35 are having a lot of trouble raising seed funds. And, they're hearing a lot of messages. You're not technically with it.
Yeah.
You're not going to work that hard.
Right.
You've got other interests.
Which is super rich coming from a VC, of course.
Of course.
Right. Not technical, don't work that hard.
Right. We don't. Our industry.
I'm kidding.
Is not,
I understand VCs work very hard. But.
Yes, but our industry is not good at self-reflection.
That's
right.
That's
in the
correct.
moment. So I found that this myth, which in some cases obviously is true, but clearly wasn't always true.
Yeah.
So the myth had become a rule, and that meant that there was opportunity, if you were smart, to look for outlier founders in categories where and in places where there really wasn't a lot of demand.
Right. And do you think the same apply? Is it a different? I guess I can't ask anybody who doesn't have the experience, but I sometimes talk to people and I'll lump together. I had people, what's it like to be a gay CEO, African American in Silicon Valley, a woman getting harassed, ageism, and I guess they're not all the same thing. I mean, they're all prejudice, which is wrong in all of its forms, but they're different, very different forms, I guess.
I don't know because I'm not those folks.
Right.
But what I do know is, so I would say that because of all the seed funds that have come up, there have been over 1,000 of these seed funds, which generally invest early and are incredibly active right now.
Yeah.
Older founders are now getting funded. And so in the last couple of years, I've had a lot of what do I do? And I recently began talking to some women. Yeah. And I met women, and God bless, sure enough, I'm hearing the same nonsense I used to hear about older founders.
Yeah.
Not technical.
Yeah.
Won't work that hard, right? And I keep thinking, well, again, for some people maybe that's true, but for a lot of people it's not.
Yeah.
And the two most recent investments I did were in women where I had thought they were going to come in with incredibly high valuations, and in fact the valuations were quite reasonable because there was a certain bias against that. And
yeah.
I just think it's opportunity. That kind of stuff is opportunity for someone like me to say, hey, maybe there's outliers who aren't really getting traction in the system, but if their name was Phil, they might.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It is kind of fascinating whether ageism is the one, I don't know if Eric heard this, but where people kind of say it out loud more.
Oh, yeah.
They'll say something like, hey, he's kind of old. He probably doesn't want to work that hard. Where if someone's like a black guy, they're not going to say, well,
right.
They're going to find some other problem for sure. It's still racism. It's still bad, but it's like, not that guy, whatever, wrong school, whatever it is.
It's very clear. Look, we are not a perfect society, and certainly there is a lot of bias that exists in the funding world. But the reality is my job I can't fix that. I'm too small to fix that of myself, but I can take it as an opportunity, right? And I think 90% of my founders are 35 and north, right? And almost all of them have struggled to get an A round, right?
Yeah.
But after that, if the business works, the business works, and it's off to the races, right? And so I view it as opportunity, not as I don't think I alone can change the day-to-day interactions that some people have to face, which I think are unfair, awful, right? And as you say, look, ageism is the one thing that people feel not only can they talk about it, they can patronize you.
Yeah.
Right. When I was interviewing at VC funds, I had one person sit and tell me, look, you're never going to get a job here because you're old and stupid. And I said, wait, I'm old or stupid? And he didn't laugh, and I couldn't, and I'm in this argument and I'm losing. So I was like, okay, this is not going to work, right? So ageism has always been the one bizarre thing that people feel like they're doing you a favor, right, when they come out and say it. And again, look, I think prejudice is opportunity. I really do.
Yeah.
And I believe that there are great female founders, there are great older founders,
right,
who didn't get funded because this archetype of Zuckerberg or whoever, Steve Jobs, this rebel male, generally under 35, is so enmeshed in the venture mythology of Silicon Valley that, quite frankly, there's a lot of people outside of that who are wonderful founders, right, who may not get early funding.
Silicon Valley, which also tells itself that it's very data-driven. I think the data is that the average entrepreneur, successful entrepreneur, is in their 40s, which makes sense. You go to work for the milkshake company or whatever the hell the McDonald's guy was doing, Ray Koch, and then you're like, oh, I see a problem. I've been working in this industry for 10 years. It's broken. I understand the 401k processing industry in a way that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't. I'm going to fix it. It makes some sense.
Right. And if you look, the biggest problem that most startups have, let me go through the two biggest problems they have. First, the issue of founder drama, right? Right. You and I form a business. We've never worked together, but on paper we look fabulous. But in reality, we hate each other, right? And in younger founding teams, that's probably the number one detractor of returns, right? Is founder drama. The second issue that plagues companies in the enterprise space where I am is a lack of thought out go to market. Right. And generally what happens with more mature founders is that they understand the go to market is as important or more than the product. Right. And that they understand how they're going to reach their customer and how they're going to scale that. Right. And so and I would say to your data driven point, one of the challenges is that in the early stage, there is no data. So prejudice abounds. Right. Or myth abounds. Right. And it's the job of people like me and others to try and figure out how to profit from that, or how we can help founders really show who's real and who's not.
It is kind of shocking in a world where people are coming and asking for $1 million or $2 million. The number of times I'll see somebody who comes in and says, "Oh, here's I'm solving this problem. I mean, the only guy who can do it." Describes a company, and you kind of say to them, "There's 10 other companies I'm aware of that are doing that. One of them's backed by Sequoia," which isn't to say you're going to beat them, but if you didn't tell me what those 10 companies were plus 7 more. I don't know you're going to beat them.
So this is one of my secrets, although it won't be secret anymore, that we're now discussing this on your fabulous podcast. But I believe that if the founders don't understand the competitors, it puts you into the less than 10% chance of being successful. And in fact, the one slide where I will, in general, when founders come in and say, "Oh, I'm only competing with these 2 legacy companies," and they have no startup competitors, it's like a red flag, right? Either they're not telling you something, or they don't understand the market. And so I look at that, and I think, again, more experienced founders are more comfortable that there's competition, and more experienced founders are going to tell you, here's why we're better. Right.
There's a bunch of ways to beat big incumbents.
Absolutely.
Like there's a lot of things that you can do that they can do. There's a lot of things they can do that you can't do.
Right.
But they're not complicated things. So to not understand that in an industry seems a little crazy to me.
That's crazy, but also to miss that there are other startups attacking the same thing and not understand what their strengths and limitations are when generally their product is out, it's public, they've blah, blah, blah a lot. If you haven't taken the time to figure that out, red flag.
Yeah. It's also, okay, this is reverse ageism with the younger founder. One thing that amuses me is sort of the range of problems that they see in the world. There's sort of the music discovery problem, and there's meeting girls, and there's not the diabetes data management because they've never been sick and they've never had to do data processing for the oil and gas industry or whatever.
Right. You're absolutely right. I had a very nice student reach out to me for career advice, and senior in college, and was trying to figure out what to do. And he said, I was reading Warren Buffett, who says, this, and I was reading Peter Lynch at Fidelity, who says that. And a lot of themes I read seem to be stick to what you know. And what I know is sneaker resale. And I'm like, hey, you're 21 years old, fabulous. Do you want to care about sneaker resale when you're 31 or 41, right? Do you want to freeze yourself now, or do you want to, kind of grow and find something more interesting, more complicated, right? And so I do think that is a challenge of sometimes. And also there's a little bit of because you haven't sold before, you don't realize how the channel impacts things, particularly again in the enterprise, is it's easy to say yada yada process is screwed up because I tried to do it once and it didn't work, right? But it's a different thing to say, who are you selling to? What's the pricing going to look like, and how do you scale? What's your CAC, right? And in a SaaS business, that's what really matters. Is in order to be fundable later, your CAC to LTV better be pretty good, right?
And I assume this is why Mark Benioff was so successful at building Salesforce, is he knew how the sales channel worked, and backwards, forwards, better than I shouldn't say better than Larry Ellison, but maybe,
maybe. And the reality is that he hit on a disruption early, and then he knew how to sell, right? And both of those things made him, into a really juggernaut of a company, right? And to build a generational company, which is what I like, you have to have both of those things, right? You have to find that disruption, and then you've got to know how to sell. And that's what I look for.
Right, and build that culture, I guess, into the company in its earliest stages and its earliest iterations. I wonder. I started my career the classic way. I went to MBA school at Northwestern, which is this rarity. You went to Duke, so this is like in Silicon Valley. These are like great schools, but like you're in the minority.
We're outliers.
Everyone went to Harvard or Stanford sometimes.
Right.
Sometimes Princeton as well, but then worked at Deloitte in their valuation finance practice, which had the implication of you just be out at some newspaper print de-inking facility and you'd learn the business and go, it's actually a very interesting business. In a million years, sitting in your dorm room, you would never get into the paper industry or whatever.
Absolutely, right. And I have met a lot of folks who come from the sort of Stanford bubble and say, oh, I've just discovered newspaper de-inking, and guess what? I'm going to revolutionize it because I'm going to put a UI around it, and all of a sudden things are going to change. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't some brilliant founders who are young. There are, right?
Yeah.
And the archetype is real for a reason, because there are a few people who do match that. Yeah. But what I really believe is that you need the experience with the customer, and you need to understand your route to market in order. Otherwise, you're going to end up having to raise too much money and experiment and pivot multiple times in order to reach that customer. And for early investors, obviously, that's bad. And for employees and for founders, generally, those moves are bad. Yeah. And if you have someone who's dead certain on how to reach the customer and how to scale that and understand it, it's what helps make a business great.
Yeah. I mean, writ large, that's the Theranos story, I guess, which is a 19-year-old says, oh, I can do something with blood that every doctor in the world has kind of just looked at the physics of it and said, you can't physically do that. And of course, no healthcare investors invested in Theranos.
Right. And that is I think the extreme example of the phenomenon of the cult of youth of, somebody who's young out of Stanford, they must be smart, they must be brilliant. And therefore, we're going to assume facts, not in evidence, right? And we're going to assume this story and look where it goes without ever saying, where's the beef, to use an old expression, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And there was nothing there. And it really does, it amazes me. And then, I think the opposite is also kind of crazy, where you have someone who's done it before, who says, I'm ready to do it again, and I think that the market's in a disruption, and the world says, no, you don't fit the right archetype. You're not right. You're old, and we know you're not going to work that hard, and we know, you're probably going to do this in 1980s technology, and we know, right? And therefore, get out of our office, right?
Yeah.
And that's the opportunity that exists for me, and say, hey, these people. There's just massive opportunity, because I think in a lot of ways, they de-risk some of the early steps in startup land.
Yeah, it's like the old Frank Zappa joke where he talks about young managers and old managers, like music managers. He's like, well, the young guys say, I'm a young guy, I know what everybody wants, and this isn't it. The old guy goes, I don't know, I've seen everything, might work, let's put it out there.
Right.
Like, it's just that humility you get with age, where you said social networking would never be a thing, and you said, the .com bubble would never happen, and eventually you're like, I honestly don't know what's going to happen.
Brilliant quote.
So when you're working at Cisco, I mean, as a notable, you were kind of an alpha dog. I mean, you were a top guy at a top corporation on the planet. How did that transition, feel? Do you like why didn't you go be the corp dev guy at Facebook or the CEO of something?
Right. It's a great question. First, let me just also say today's kind of a sad day, because the first chairman of the board when I joined Cisco, Don Valentine, has passed away.
Did you interact with him?
I did. Don, famously in Upside magazine, had said that the day Cisco hires a lawyer, and I'm a lawyer by background, mea culpa, I'm on the 12th step of the recovery, but this is the day I quit. And so for a long time, I had to dance around. What do you do, Dan? Well, it's kind of complicated.
Not the law.
Not the law, but the law. But you know, I make things better.
So one of the, if not the most, one of the most successful venture capital firms is Sequoia. He founded that firm, was chairman of it, was chairman of Cisco, and I think invested in a lot of things, but Apple.
Yeah, Apple.
When it was a, couple of chairs and a...
Yeah, no, he was early in a lot of things. He was a brilliant investor and, quite frankly, a brilliant business mind. And he had the ability to see through the fog and the nonsense and to ask brilliant and insightful questions. And so, anyway, I've been thinking about him the last 48 hours, and I wanted to say that. In terms of me, I'll tell you the story. So I'm a bit of a pain in the ass. And I was at Cisco on the ride up, and it was really fun. We had a great time. We were scaling. We were, laying railroad tracks as the railroad was moving, and it was really great. 2000 hit, and it had a profound impact on a lot of things. And I felt a duty of loyalty to stay and help fix things. And I took over running Corp Dev to try and help do my best to help fix things.
Yeah. The stock went from like $85 to 10 or something like. Is that directionally what happened?
My stomach is hurting, but thank you, Ken.
I'm sorry.
That was highly accurate of what happened.
Spoiler alert, it gets better later.
It does get better later, spoiler alert, but not without a lot of work and a lot of pain and suffering. But I would tell you that I do not believe anybody knows how to run a large-scale tech company. It's hard. And as growth proved more difficult and elusive, figuring out how to run the company became really hard. And for me, it became frustrating. It was very hard to figure out how to be effective in a large company. And the skills that I saw people progressing with were skills, the presentation skills, the ability to explain bad news, right? Mm-hmm. And these were skills where I was really lacking, right? I'm not that great getting up in a room presenting vision with no substance, and I'm not really that great at explaining failure as victory, right? And the culture changed, and it became a culture of a place where I wasn't as comfortable. And so, I either said you have to change or move. Yeah. And I decided that I wanted to move. And then I decided, really, what am I good at? I am good. One of the things I've learned at Cisco, we ran Corp Dev after the bubble. And the biggest insight we had looking at all of our past deals had been really the numbers and the analysis. And again, sorry for your background on this, but the numbers and the analysis were secondary to the EQ. Right? If the CEO stayed and the CEO liked the boss and the boss liked the CEO, you had a huge chance of, not a huge, but you had a much, much better chance of success. If those things were not true, you were 100% sure to fail, right? Yeah, right. 99%, right? One of them may have not failed, but it was almost incredible. So I realized the EQ mattered more than the IQ. And then, so I said, as an early stage investor, I'm hopeful that I have good EQ, and I'm hopeful that I can, that I'm going to use that insight to try and drive value. Yeah. And it's the part of the whole process I really love is helping people, right? I mean, that comes back even from my legal days where I was a service provider. Right. And I view myself as a VC as really, I'm a service provider to the founder to help them try and be successful. Yeah. And so I said, I want to do this. I went into VC funds. They basically gave me the old and stupid pitch, as we talked about. Yeah. And
is that true? Really, all of them were just like, no. It is one of the hardest jobs in the world to get, just because there's not very many of them on this planet.
Yes. And let me be frank, too, which is I walked in with not low ego, saying, hey, I've done a lot of this, look at me. Yeah. Right? But the response I got was not, hey, let's talk about this. The response was, again, how quickly can we get you out of here because you're old and stupid. You're not going to work that hard. Yeah. Your contact network is not that useful. Blah, 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 blah. And I was like, wow, this is real. And people would stop and take the time to explain to me in detail why I was old and stupid. Right? I'm like, okay, this is, right. Not only is this not going the right direction.
This doesn't feel very good.
This doesn't feel very good, right? So I said, okay, chip on shoulder, inserted. I'm going to go back. Like when I started, I had kind of a chip on my shoulder. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to go and prove that I can build something here. Yeah. And I actually, some of the more philosophical VCs I talked to who were really nice to spend time, quite frankly, Mark Andreessen graciously spent time with me in the early days.
Lovely.
And what he said to me was, the one thing that I can tell you is I don't like the spray and pray style of angel investing. Find 1 to 2 things and focus, because then you'll get better deals because people know you're there, and you'll also be able to influence and impact the trajectory of the company. And I actually believe that's right. So I'm more of a 1 to 2 a year kind of person, and other folks were very generous about kind of teaching me what works, what doesn't, how they approach things, so that when I bring things to them, it can make sense.
Yeah, one of the which means you have a very focused strategy. One of the things I like making fun of VCs. It's what I do myself, but I want to stay humble. Is VCs taking difficult math or easy math and acting like it's difficult?
Right.
And so, one of the ones is in diversification, which in public stocks they've done. It happens around 30. You're diversified with respect to the public markets. Not 1,000, not 5, and like. People will learn about diversification, and so you'll say, okay, have a portfolio of 25 companies, because in venture, one big outlier is the whole 2 big outliers. And they'll go, well, you should then have 100 companies, because that's more diversification. You're like, wow, that's like the simplest way to think about diversification. By the way, have 1 million companies. And
right. Right. No, and the reality, what I think is that in some ways, the people, venture divides again into the intuitive types and the sort of analytical types. And I think there's been no industry more overanalyzed than venture itself, right? It spends so much time analyzing things. And I think that analysis sometimes leads to the wrong conclusion. The mission is clear. Find bloody outliers, right?
Yep.
And that is the mission. That's the goal. That's what you want to go do, right? Yeah. And in order to find outliers, it's particularly if you're going early, the analysis isn't going to help you. In fact, the analysis, I find, in general, hurts you.
Right.
Because you're missing the obvious thing, which is I've got, one of the great people in the world sitting in front of me asking for advice.
Yeah.
Right? When you have one of those people, you write the check and it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right?
And how do you see through people who are good in a room? One of the things I feel that seed investors, so the Series A game is who the winners are, and you just have to be better than Sequoia at getting into the deal. So that's a loser for me.
Right.
But as you sit down with an entrepreneur, I find some people walk in, they went to Stanford, they went to Harvard, they got a patent, they've traveled, whatever, and they're really good in a room. But I get the sense that the second they've had no difficulty. They went to work at Facebook. What goes wrong at Facebook? Like the lunch was colder than normal. Like, and it's on the one hand wildly impressive. On the other hand, you just kind of walk away going, are you going to, the first time you got to make payroll from your credit card, what's going to,
So I descend from immigrants. In fact, yes. I descend from kind of Bolshevik immigrants, yeah. Right? My grandmother used to always say there's book smart and there's real smart, right? And I tend to believe that if you can find the people who have soul and who have drive, right, that's what you want. And I think that there are people who mimic soul and drive,
yeah.
Right? And then there are people who have it. And you just have to, that's where you have to trust yourself. And I find myself with some of these folks feeling like I could be in a room with anybody, right? I mean, yes, the presentation is good. Yes, the words are right, but there's no essence of you that's there, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm in clunkier presentations, but you can feel the energy, the passion, and you can feel the essence of that person.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is the presentation really matters to me, right? Because I think that's where you're putting forth your thoughts. And so I'm a presentation fascist, to be honest.
Okay.
I want great presentations because a lot of times that Stanford guy has not thought through the presentation and said, I know my resume is going to get funding, so right. We'll figure it out later, right? And I don't like that, and that bothers me. And I want to see someone who's put the effort in to think through things, right? And I want someone who's really particularly thought through, who is my competition? What are they doing? Why am I differentiated? Mm-hmm. And what's my route to market, right? And you would think that's obvious, but I've heard a lot of later stage folks say, early stage, it doesn't really matter. They'll figure it out, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but all those things they'll figure it out means they're capital inefficient. They're going to raise a lot of money. They've got to hire and fire people because they're going left and going right. And so for me, I think that presentation really matters. and presentation and is core. So I don't just look at the technical skills, because in some ways that reminds me of the Cisco problem. When I see someone presenting well, but looking beautiful and all that, right? It just says, okay, I'm back at Cisco, right? But when I see the thinking being right, that's what I love.
Yeah. It is funny the number of presentations I'll sit down with somebody and they'll get to the end of the presentation. I'm like, what do you do? Like, I get the problem in this market. I get all that. Like, do you sell something that I buy? When I tell people that, they're just like, how can you not do that?
Yeah. I had one where the guy delivered a presentation and I said, where did this presentation come from? And he said to me, I wasn't sure, but I decided to lift some other successful startup's presentation that was on some site, and I just kind of customize it for what I'm doing, and since it worked for them. And I'm like, so none of this is stuff you thought through? Yeah. No, I just look, I'm Ubermensch out of Stanford, and so I'll figure it out, right? And I'm like, with somebody else, right?
The other one I see is like, what do you want? Like, you get to the end of the presentation, and instead of saying, I'd like $1 million to hit these 3 milestones, and we can argue about whether these are good milestones or not, they're just like, there it is. You're like, okay.
Yeah. Well, I would say a couple of things. What do you want? How long does it last you? And what do you think you need to do to get the next round or two? Right?
Yes.
And so we're obviously at the late stages of a golden era of venture investing. Yeah. And of course, I think things may go down, but they'll go back up again. It'll be fine in the long term. But there's been a lot of sloppiness that gets built into some of how people are approaching things, and there's this pressure on funds, which I understand, which is if you miss something, it can be a disaster. And so when you feel like you can't miss, that's when you start, at least early, you start thinking about archetypes. Yeah. Right. And I've heard some of my friends say, oh, this guy looked right. Right. And I think there's so much wrong with that statement, right?
On its face, literally.
On its face, literally, right? But again, for me, I just say, okay, this is opportunity. But yes, I think there's a lot about, do I think that the current system could be made more fair? Yes. Am I going to push to do that? Well, not quite, because I think there's opportunity for guys like me, right? That if the system became more fair, that wouldn't be there.
So as you become a not big Sand Hill Road VC, but your own VC, and start shaping that career, how did you think about this spectrum of kind of becoming a brand? So there's some VCs, I won't mention, they're very branded. They're always blogging, they're always podcasting, whatever. I should talk. And then there's guys who, like, if you don't know who Tim Connors is, like, look it up. They're fabulous, but your average person hasn't heard of them. And their LPs, like, it's the best thing. They're the most successful investors you've never heard of. Did you kind of think through which of those you...
I'm at the crossroads of that right now. Yeah. Now, first of all, I'm blessed. I have an LP benefit that few have, which is I get to sleep with my LP.
Yeah.
Right. So I haven't raised money from anyone else. So I'm really doing this with my own capital, because I didn't want to have to worry about what an LP might.
And LPs are the group of people behind Silicon Valley who give money to these venture funds and make this whole thing possible.
Right.
Except in your case.
Except in my case. So the reality is that right now I'm at a little bit of a crossroads. I've been blessed with some success, right?
Enormous success.
And I believe my current portfolio has other enormous successful companies in it. Yeah. And part of me says it's time to raise your profile a little bit and to try and help attract more inbound interest. Another part of me says you're only one person. And the reality is that attracting more inbound interest means you're going to get more consumer deals, which I don't do, or other things, or health deals, which I don't do, right? And it's not going to help you in the core enterprise space. But this issue has been rattling around in my head. Yeah. I've started to talk to some of my closest advisors about what they would do, and I get basically 2 strands of advice. Either be authentic, stay the way you are. The good people will know who you are and just stay that way. And other folks who say, no, look, you got to go build a brand because you're losing out to people who are less qualified than you to help these folks, right? Because you're not spending the time blogging and commenting and doing this stuff. So I'm right now I'm in the middle of an existential crisis on this, to be totally honest. And I wake up thinking about it. I go to sleep at night and I'm thinking about it. Last night, as a matter of fact, I was rattling around in my brain. So I need to have an answer, but I don't have a good one right now. Is the truth.
As you hit these successes like Zoom, and sort of what anyone would consider enormous wealth sort of comes out of it. How does that feel? Like, is there ever a moment where Zoom goes public where you just kind of say, this is kind of a crazy amount of wealth and really frees me up? And not that, working at Cisco is a bad job, but like this is some other level and I need to, I don't know. Like, so how does that?
So let me tell you, one good thing about having some gray hair myself is I went through this once before. And in 2000, so Cisco stock effectively between 97 and 2000 went up $1 a day. Yeah. Okay, on average. And in 2000, I found myself as one of the wealthiest people in the planet, and I had a brain freeze because I didn't know what to do. And it made me, I knew what I didn't want. I said, I don't want to be, I don't want to turn myself into an entitled rich guy. That was okay, well, that's cool.
That puts you ahead of 90% of the game.
Yeah, okay, but what do you want?
Yeah.
I don't know, right? And so... and mercifully, the market took care of that existential dilemma got taken care of. Right. When we hit $9 a share. So the reality is that this time, I'm going to tell you some of the strangest things, which is it's really not about money for me. The thing that really makes me excited is being right, like watching Arista or the Treasure Data guys or Zoom really succeed has been really satisfying to me. And I feel very, it makes me happy to know and say, hey, I've had a small part in helping them realize their dreams. And, so, and then the second thing is there's a lot of stuff where we have to give back because I think there are gaps in the world. And so I have tried to start, as a family, we do a lot of that. Yeah. My vision on that has always been you do it quietly, you don't put your name next to anything, and you do it in a way that hopefully helps the next generation or helps people in need. But I have not bought a car. I have not bought a house. I mean, I don't need things. I want to see hopefully that we can do some good. With the resources we have.
And so with the capital, rather than sitting on a beach or something like that, it is you do want to find the next woman or man who's developing something that's going to change how people work or think. Or
absolutely. I can talk about. There's a bunch of stuff that's kind of interesting in portfolio. We talked about oil and gas briefly earlier. I had the fortune to meet a founding team of brothers, and of course that's another not in the archetype, right? Brothers, married couples, that doesn't fit, right?
Right.
And these guys had a second problem that also is not in the early stage archetype. They didn't have a market, and so they were brilliant. The CTO is a professor. He'd been at Jerusalem University. He'd been at Princeton, and now he's at Tel Aviv University, and he had developed battle-tested AI algorithms and was looking to figure out where he could apply those algorithms. And for a year, we spent wandering the desert, trying to find a market. In fact, I had them watch old Cisco and GE commercials to see if any of those markets made any sense. And they didn't for a whole variety of reasons. But eventually we found that the automation of oil and gas production was a massive opportunity that had been untouched. And the company moved to Houston. They began to apply the algorithm into production machines, and the results have been phenomenal, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a company that, that basically was unfundable, except that I loved the two founders, right?
Yeah.
And I said, these two brothers are fantastic. The drive they had, the clear goal to build a meaningful company, right? And it's been great. I'm in another company called CyCognito, which is a security company where the founder was, in intelligence and began to see how intelligence agencies attack the bad guys. And he began to say, could we create something to protect the good guys out of the same thing? And sure enough, right, began to build a platform to go do this, right? Yeah. And And then I would also just say the two companies I've just invested in who are female led, one company was two women who had been working on a problem in a startup in San Francisco and saw this problem of how to train not only within various silos, but across the silos, the SaaS silos. So you might have Salesforce and Workday and yada, yada, yada. And it's the same policy, but you need to train all the way across. And they figured out a way to say, here's how we're going to do this in a simple, right, easy but powerful manner. We were the customer. We know what we wanted, and here we go. And it's been, really incredible. And in fact, again, they heard all the same old stuff of, you're not that technical, this, that, the other thing. But the reality was they had solved the problem that is one of these kind of glaring, massive problems. So there's and more. I'm very excited, and my hope is that my story doesn't end with the things that have worked to date, but in fact, it's going to be about the next 3, 4, 5 things.
That does seem to be the one lesson, that when you say it's all over, 2002, people were saying everything that's been invented on the internet, that's going to be invented on the internet, has been invented. Very sober people with, jackets and blazers and very impressive.
Vests.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. It's got to be vests.
So just one last or a couple things. Do you, as you help your founders, I've had a number of people on start to talk about mental health issues, like the depression of Silicon Valley. Keller Fitzsimmons was on, she wrote a book about it. And it's this combination of how difficult it is to start a company and the ethos of Silicon Valley, which is everybody's winning. Everyone else is having an easy time and gold doubloons are falling out of the sky. And the reality of Jesus, this is really hard.
This is, so yes, is the issue. I think this is another, when you're in an area where everyone is successful in theory, right? Yeah. It's really hard when you're struggling to come up and admit it. And I also believe it's a real problem, particularly when you're a bit older, because, finding a friend group that you trust at an older age is really hard, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know that I have answers except to say that, I'm entirely empathetic when it happens, and I don't view it as weakness. Look, I've been in companies that have failed, right? And in general, it's a very stressful thing, and I try and check in and make sure that the founders really are okay, right? And that's part of why we try and help them have as gentle a landing as possible, right? But this is still, it's very hard, and it's something that there's not an easy set of answers around. And there are certainly, I have met people who, unfortunately, there's some people who fail over and over again, and you ask them how it's going, and they're killing it, right? That personality type, you don't worry about.
Yeah, right.
But it's the ones who fail once, and then it just weighs over them. Yeah. They never quite get out of that. Yeah. And the one joy I do learn about this area is you can fail, and it's not only is it okay, right? It's okay, it's how you deal with it, right? But I'm not really giving you a great answer, but just to say, I know this issue is real, and I know that I have founders who are struggling with some of these issues, and all we can do is try and be there and support them as they go through what they go through.
Well, one last thing for you. You describe yourself as a contrarian, which a lot of people in Silicon Valley describe themselves with. I imagine you're a little bit more thoughtful about this than most.
Right, Ken. And so first of all, I have never met anyone in Silicon Valley who doesn't describe themselves as a contrarian, right? So I'm a contrarian, and I wear vests, right? My difference is I actually wear jackets. That's why I'm a contrarian. So I am dyed in the wool. I was born in a family that is kind of an intellectual family, right? I'm sadly the dumbest child that was produced. But one of the things that happens is that we were always questioning why, right? And and my father is an academic, an academic doctor. His breakthrough was because he went one direction and the world went another direction, and he turned out to be right and the world turned out to be wrong, right? Yeah. So I grew up with that mythology, and for whatever reason, I've always tried to believe that lazy thinking and groupthink leave opportunities. Now, again, sometimes lazy thinking and groupthink work, right? That's why people do it, right? But that's not my personality. For whatever reason, I'm never one of those people. I'm not going to be in those rooms. Yeah. And so I always say, I've got to find a way to find something different, because if I don't find something different, I'm going to be a bad version of that. And it feels more true to who I am. And it feels more, where my energy and passion is. And so, when I did the older founder thing, actually, after throwing Zoom out, one VC took me to lunch and said, "Okay, number one, this proves why you're old and stupid, and second, it's okay to be, contrarian, but why don't you try and be more like everyone else?" Right. And I love that quote so much. I was like, that's it, right? That tells you everything you know, right? It's okay to be contrarian if you're like everybody else, right? And I'm just not wired that way. I can't function that way. And it's ultimately, I amaze myself that I survived so long in a big company. Yeah. Because I wasn't able to play those kind of games that well. Right. I had this core belief that if you do the work well, things will get taken care of. And I learned over time that that's actually not the way large companies work. There's all these other elements. You got to take care of things. But I have to be true to myself and my own instincts. And that means I've got to find things, I've got to be able to trust my own ideas. Yeah. And I believe a lot of the conventional wisdom is in fact wrong. Right. So if you stick with conventional wisdom, you end up in a place where you're chasing really excellent franchises like Sequoia and others, right? Yeah. And and let me just close with one other thought, which is today in the business, what's happening is, because of the enormity of the returns, a lot of funds are becoming more vertically integrated, right? And so it really means if you're not in there early, you have a real problem sometimes now getting in the system. It's not impossible; it just makes it a little weirder, right? And so, if you're going to be contrarian these days, you've got to really say, I'm going to help these entrepreneurs all the way through, right? And I'm going to be with them and try and figure out how to get them in the system later, or we're going to try and figure out how to find the right partners for them, and that you have to be willing to be wrong and be an idiot and be taken to lunch and told you're an idiot, right? And revel in that to some extent, right? Hey, honey, I got called an idiot 10 times today. Success, right? That's right. But to be totally honest, after Zoom, one of the things that has worried me a lot is I'm now getting you're always a genius, which is also wrong, right? And I'm having more trouble with that, right? Because they're sitting there saying, well, obviously you're Midas touch, you're always right. I'm like, no, look at this, I screwed up. Look at that, I screwed up, right? I'm not always right. I'm Dan, I'm right and wrong, right? So anyway.
This has been fantastic. So how do people follow you or get in touch with you, or should they not? I don't know if you've solved that problem in the last couple of minutes.
Oh, no. Seriously, follow me. I am DSCHEINM, which was my old email name, at Twitter. And I'm findable there. I'm also on LinkedIn, where I try and blog once a quarter. But please follow me on Twitter, where I'm trying to be, topical and hopefully funny. Sometimes, even serious. But yes, frequently tweeting, often wrong, seldom in doubt.
All right. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
Ken, thank you. An honor and a privilege.
All right. This has been the Something Adventure podcast. Talk to you next time.